Hi. Actually, I wanted you to sort of give us a message for young people and especially young women that are there. And I guess that's where we'll begin from.
Well, we know that young women in this world and people in general represent today one of the largest generations the world has seen, and that the young women of today and the young women of tomorrow are going to be almost equally as numerous. And young people in general have a big responsibility for their well-being in the future of the world, partly because they will inherit many of the problems that the older generations have created, and partly because it's going to be very important that they make use of all the advantages they are likely to have in this world.
Right.
One of the most important being the possibilities of getting educated. They are likely to have much better education than the parents ever had, and to use that education in order to think about how to change the way societies work, so
Right.
for the betterment of everyone.
Oh, cool. Okay, my second question was that since you've spoken so much about population and you're related to the department, so what are the connections that you see between population and climate change? Do you think there are linkages and that people could work together to sort of improve upon both?
Well, the most basic relationship is that without population, we would not be having climate change, because everyone agrees that the climate change that we're likely to face at this moment is generated because there's human beings. So it's the activities of human beings that are responsible for this climate change that we're generating. So, but the way the relationships are seen is in two perspectives. One is adaptation, and the problem of adaptation becomes much more difficult when you have large numbers of people living in very poor conditions, because they don't have the resources by which they're going to change their way of either behaving or their way of protecting themselves against environmental change. The richer countries will um, have, undergo the problems of environmental change. Some of it is already happening as we speak, but they have more resources to cope, while the poor countries don't have so many resources to cope, and it is in the poor countries that we're having the highest population growth. So there's more possibility of more people suffering in developing countries, just because there's lots of them there. So to the extent that the growth of those populations becomes smaller, you will have more resources and less likelihood of so many people suffering from the expected changes that will take place because of climate change. So that's on the side of adaptation. On the side of mitigation, there are many studies, some relatively sophisticated, that when modeling the demands that people are making on the environment, and especially their impact on the atmosphere, they find that the more people there are in certain places, always mediated by consumption, is it has an impact, of course, on the, the creation of climate change. So in order to mitigate climate change, you want reductions of population, and even reductions in the populations that are relatively poor today seem to be important in the future, because the expectation is that those populations will develop and they will put more demands on the environment. And so essentially, the more you expect them to develop, the more you want them to be less numerous, so that you will have more to distribute among fewer people.
Right. Okay. And any specific contributions that you think that young women of this world can give towards both these sectors, as well as, like, I do understand that you spoke about education, you spoke about the fact that means that young women having kids at around 15 is not bad, but then again, the fact that they need to sort of control, say, maybe a little time later, right? Needs to be worked
Well,
upon.
what we see is that young people in the countries that are doing the best are getting very educated.
Right.
Usually, women get more education than men if they're given the chance.
Right.
And that means they remain in the educational system till relatively advanced stages. That means they're mid 20s.
Right.
And therefore, another thing we're seeing is that marriage is being postponed by both men and women, and the age at procreation is also being postponed, and that means that it helps reduce fertility because you're reducing the actual life of procreation that women have. They're also having access to contraception, so they can control how many children they have and when to have them. And that is all for the best because that allows them to be more productive in the workforce or in whatever they want to do. If they want to just stay at home and make sure that their children have the best care they require, that's fine as long as they have the wherewithal to do it. That's what we see in the developed world, and many people are very familiar with this. In the developing world, in many countries, we're seeing a change towards more or less the same patterns, except that with lower education, women don't stay at school so long, and the childbearing is still relatively young, but by relatively young, I mean in their 20s.
Okay.
Because in the developed world, women are postponing the childbearing so much that it starts in the late 20s or even the 30s.
Right.
So childbearing in the 20s usually is the best age in which to have children. But then again, if women are going to stop having children at around 2, they finish childbearing pretty soon and they have another 20 years to do something. So one sees a lot more participation in the formal labor force, and also very often because of necessity, just participation in productive activities because they need to satisfy the needs of their family. And then the countries that have very high fertility, the problem is that women do have to work very much in providing for the family. You know, that's where you hear that young girls at very young ages have to be taking care of their siblings if their mother is having 4, 5, 6 children. So they start essentially working at very young ages, taking care of the family, and then they're married very young, start having children of their own, and essentially spend all their time just being mothers and carers for the family and don't have opportunities to do much else. It is work, and some of it is productive work because they have to do the agricultural work in many cases. And the questions we've been having and we've been discussing today is that the best use of our human resources, especially our female resources? And if the answer is no, one of the main elements that helps change their lives is to give them the means of deciding how many children to have so that they don't have them just as they come. That they can space more the birth of their children so that mothers have more time to devote to the babies. And all that usually leads to reductions of fertility in the whole population and to improvements over generations of the status of women.
Right. But then I had a question. The thing is this, you just spoke about the fact that, it's being seen in a lot of developing countries too. But then, like, for example, I come from India, and I do know that, towards the urban areas, and especially with the urbanization trends, what you're saying does fit a lot of women. But on the other hand, if you still go towards the rural side, wherein, like, child marriage is in, and on top of that, like, a lot of women are forced into a lot of things wherein education is not given preference. I mean, the simple case of, like, male children being preferred. These kind of things, how do you think, are we prepared to deal with that? Because
India has a very severe problem in the sense that there's huge inequality, and that, as you say, it's a tale of the 3 worlds in one country, because you have very educated women that are just at the top of the class, not only in India but internationally. You have the middle classes where the women are doing much better. They're even having choices about exactly if they have a career, which men to marry. Sometimes they can even decide exactly on their partners, and it's not a family decision. So again, a big change in the lives of the middle classes that are increasing in number. And then you have the people that are poor, both in urban areas and especially in rural areas, especially in the north, where not much has changed and where the status of women is very low and where they're not valued and where the life I describes well how they live, and they don't have a lot of options. And what one hopes is that sooner rather than later, the changes that are happening in the middle classes will percolate to the poor, together with programs that alleviate poverty, that improve the status of women by giving them other choices. And again, critical in that is giving them the means of deciding when to have children and preventing child marriages.
Thank you. That
You're
was
very
good.
welcome.